paranormal. It surrounds us. It's everywhere. Tonight, you will hear from the people who live and work within these highly active locations, all in the efforts to discover America's most haunted. With your host, ghost hunter and author, Dan Terry.
Good evening, boys and ghouls. I am Dan Terry, your ghost host with the most haunted. And guys, we have got this incredible guest. You're going to love this one. And let me tell you, when I was a kid and we had one television in the house, it got 3 networks and 4 other independent channels. And my father was a Western guy. He loved the Westerns, and I was a Star Trek kid. They set me down in front of Lost in Space when I was a little kid because it kept me quiet. And after that, man, I was into science fiction. But back when I was a little older, I'm going into 11, 12 years old, the only good science fiction and fantasy and whatever was on the local educational channel, Channel 9 KETC, and they showed the Twilight Zone. You guys remember this? That guaranteed there was some sci-fi or something I could think about, something that would give me ideas that would last. If you've seen some of these episodes, we're going to talk about some of the best. My guest tonight is Arlen Schumer, who has written, well, guys, he is a huge fan of the Twilight Zone. We just spent about 20 minutes just talking about favorite episodes and what these meant. But Arlen wrote a book called The 5 Themes of the Twilight Zone. And when he told them to me, it's like, yeah, okay, I see where you're going with that. And I could place episodes in each category as he named it off. And if you are a sci-fi person, and I got to tell you guys, Halloween is done. I hate to see it over with, but it's another year away. Well, actually, I start celebrating right after July 5th. But the point of it is, it's time to change up a little bit. I've been showing you ghost hunters and haunted places, but now I want to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart and to my guest. Arlen Schumer is going to discuss the Twilight Zone.
Yes.
All right, that show was just so incredible. And can you say it? Tales of the Crypt come directly from the Twilight Zone.
What doesn't?
Yeah, right. The X-Files, Kolchak, The Night Stalker, all of those shows owe something to Rod Serling.
Dan, not only did I love your introduction, because you set the stage perfectly for what the Twilight Zone was, but, people immediately say it was a science fiction show. And of course, its greatest episodes were probably science fiction episodes, but it wasn't only science fiction, even though Serling had some luminaries like Richard Matheson and Charles Beaumont and George Clayton Johnson writing some of the greatest episodes.
Some of the best.
But it was not, people think it was a horror show. Well, there were some horror episodes, some of the greatest ever filmed for television or movies. And then people say it was a fantasy show. Well, it had elements of fantasy too, but it was more real and true for its day, as well as still speaking to us in the 21st century. And therefore, it was all of those things and more, as they say. Mm-hmm. In my book, I posited that the Twilight Zone is really surrealism on television. And surrealism, if you really study it, and you know what? It's the 100th anniversary of surrealism itself this year. It's the 50th anniversary of the Twilight Zone, October 2nd. And it's Serling's centennial, born on Christmas Day. Nice Jewish boy, born on Christmas Day. But my point is that The Twilight Zone was all of those things, but surrealism in its original intention was meant for people to step back from reality and judge it anew. The word surreal, the French word sur, means on top of reality, stepping back. When you hum the do, when people do that because something weird is happening,
Right.
something strange, what they're doing is acknowledging a moment of surrealist experience that the original surrealists intended, and that Rod Serling, whether he knew it or not, was a pop American surrealist. And I call him in the Twilight Zone the father of American popular culture in my book. And I know that sounds grandiose,
No.
but what I mean by that is what you were getting at when you rattled off all those shows. Serling's, he had two daughters, a couple years older than me, but his metaphorical children are today's modern science fiction, fantasy, and horror creators.
Yes.
Everybody from Stephen King to Steven Spielberg, from James Cameron to J.J. Abrams to Chris Carter to Black Mirror, in England, Charlie Brooker, to everybody that has created our modern American popular culture.
Mm-hmm.
If you name a successful or cultish science fiction, horror, or fantasy product, Dan, I can connect it back to Twilight Zone and what I call 6 degrees of Serling.
That's I can see it. I can see it. But just to start us out on that.
By the way, there's my book.
Yes.
You mentioned that, my beautiful little black and white hardcover.
Poltergeist.
Yes.
Taken from an episode.
Little Girl Lost, written by Richard Matheson.
Mm-hmm.
About, remember Poltergeist? Ooh, they're here. About a little girl that disappears through a dimensional portal in her bedroom wall, right?
Right.
Matheson wrote that as a short story, originally based on a real life experience when his first daughter, him and his wife could hear their daughter crying from the bedroom. And when Matheson went in to check, he looked everywhere. She wasn't there. He looked under the bed. She wasn't there. But he could hear her still crying. It turns out she had rolled so far under the bed that she rolled into a corner of the room that he wouldn't even think to look.
Yeah.
Well, art imitates life, Dan, and he wrote Little Girl Lost, which was made into a great, very memorable Twilight Zone episode.
And eventually a movie with 4 sequels.
Right, exactly. And,
all right. Yeah. We were talking earlier about the 5 themes.
By the way, I want to show people I'm wearing
of course.
Twilight Zone shirt.
We were talking about the 5 themes, and would you tell these folks what you see it as the 5 themes?
Okay, so when I coined the 5 themes way back in 1991, believe it or not, and that's a whole story unto itself, they came to me almost in a flash. Science and superstition, suburban nightmares, a question of identity, obsolete man, the time element. Now, Twilight Zone aficionados, Dan, and I'm not sure you are.
I missed one.
I don't know if you passed my litmus test, but a sharp Twilight Zone aficionados will recognize that only one of those 5 does not have a direct Twilight Zone reference. Mm-hmm. So this is like, Alex, I'll take Twilight Zone for 400. You must ask in form of a question. But yes, those are the 5 themes that, and by the way, to answer the quiz, it's suburban nightmares is the only one I coined.
Would you put that one, Little Girl Lost? Because losing your kid is a nightmare.
That is a suburban nightmare, because that's exactly what it was in Richard Matheson's real life.
Yes.
It was a suburban night. Listen, the idea of your kids disappearing is every parent's nightmare. Twilight Zone tapped into Serling and the Twilight Zone writers, because they all, I talk about this in my preface and introduction in my book. They all wrote under these 5 themes, whether they were realizing or not. just based on my categorizing them that way. And, you know, it turns out that, I don't even know where I was going with that. You know, I go on so many tangents. I need a script girl to keep track of my tangents.
That's all right. Well, let's talk about some of the individual episodes and where they fit in your categories. We talked a little bit before about the obsolete man, which has its own category there.
Exactly.
The category was named after that. In that one, we saw the possibility of a futuristic society in which the government runs everyone and everything. And if you're not part of the government, you're an enemy.
Well, it's not if you're part of the government, if you're obsolete, if you don't matter anymore. And Burgess Meredith is a librarian named, a little too on the nose, Rod, Wordsworth.
I loved it.
Wordsworth. And Fritz Weaver goes, Wordsworth, a librarian, a man of books. And of course, books have been outlawed. And, you know, it's
Right.
Sterling's classic Orwellian, you know, Fahrenheit 51 take.
Which is not far from what had happened in the Soviet Union,
Well,
where they
of
got
course,
rid of anything that was
that
not
was
pro.
a big part of, and very Ayn Randian, totalitarian state. But yes, I mean, Sterling came out of World War II, just like J.D. Salinger, Norman Mailer, a whole generation, Bud Schulber, Jack Kirby, everybody that created the post-war American pop culture. And many of these men worked out their basically post-traumatic stress syndrome from World War II
Right.
creatively into their works. And Sterling was, you know, one of them. And
Okay, go ahead.
yeah, so out of that came the Twilight Zone, taking his societal concerns and what he saw. I posit him as a visionary of the 1960s because so many of his great Twilight Zone episodes dealt with the themes that would become what we know of as the 60s, the counterculture, Vietnam, you know, bigotry, racism, the civil rights movement, assassinations, everything the 60s became. Serling, and I talk about this in my essays in my book, became Serling was, and the other writers put into these Twilight Zone episodes.
Right.
And that's what makes them not only of their time, but still speak to us today. I did a whole webinar during the pandemic shutdown called Twilight Zone in the Age of Corona, where I showed excerpts from episodes that dealt with the things we were going through: isolation, loneliness, deserted cities,
Public fear.
Exactly.
The bomb shelter episode where the neighbors were trying to attack to get in.
Absolutely. That was a suburban nightmare.
Let me throw this one out at you.
Yeah.
They had one with Walter Koenig, and that episode was so controversial it wasn't even shown again. For
No,
like
you're talking
40 years.
about not Koenig, George Takei.
Takei, yes, I had the wrong Star Trek.
The Encounter.
Yes.
Yes, he plays a Japanese American and dealing with the post, you know, internment camp idea that ended up being Takei's really life story.
Mm-hmm.
And here, like Twilight Zone as usual, forecasts the future. And what's his name? The other actor, Noel. I always forget his name.
Yeah, I
Noel Redding or something like that. I don't know. But anyway, he played a classic American, you know, blue collarish World War II vet,
Right.
still harboring prejudice and bitterness about the Japanese. And Takei is harboring, you know, bitterness about the way the Japanese were treated. Serling, again, in 1964, being so far ahead of his time in dealing with issues that, like I said, we're still dealing with in the 21st century.
Absolutely.
When we look back. Like I said, Takei ended up making that his life mission with, I forget the name of the play he ended up producing and whatever, but you know what I mean.
Right.
So for whatever reason, the censors at the time thought it was too, you know, they say too soon. In 1964, they thought it was too soon to deal with those issues.
20
it's not
years
a great
later.
episode. I mean, again, I don't write about it in my book. It's not a particularly, you know, it's just, listen, like I said, Dan, I could talk ad infinitum, ad nauseum literally, about the episodes I did not include in my book.
Yeah.
You know, I only include, I think we talked about it before, 68 out of 156, which might sound harsh, but I compare it to a baseball hitter's average. 68 great episodes out of 156. I think it's like batting 435.
Yeah.
You know, Serling wrote 92 of the 156 episodes. 41 of those 92 are in my book. That's like batting 465 or something. And, you know, weekly television back then in the early 60s, especially anthology drama, was very difficult to do at a high quality level week after week.
Yes.
On a tight budget. You didn't have continuing characters and the same sets every week like sitcoms have. No, anthology drama, which is why you don't see it anymore, because it's too expensive. It's too hard, literally.
But Arlen, how many times have they tried to redo the Twilight Zone?
And they all suck. Sorry, I'm very
They
hard
do.
again. Starting with the horrible Spielberg movie. Yeah,
that movie was just retelling Spielberg or Serling's best.
You know that movie is also cursed.
I've heard, yes.
You know the background of what happened.
And Vic Morrow getting killed.
Yeah, so my point is, not only was the film, in my opinion, for Spielberg to have such a creative flop, starting with the fact that they filmed it all in color, and I make a case in all of my lectures about the Twilight Zone that the Twilight Zone was a black and white concept, the middle ground between light and shadow. The issues the Twilight Zone episodes dealt with, life and death, good and evil, man and society, man and God, all the great themes are very black and white themes. And yet none of the remakes, which I think, again, starting with the Spielberg movie, the couple Twilight Zone syndicated shows, poor Forrest Whitaker had to be a Serling stand-in, one of those syndicated. And then, you know, they gave it to Jordan Peele a few years ago.
Yes.
Saw any of those.
Never seen it.
Two 10-episode, 1 hour episodes, 20 total. I thought they all sucked. I mean, and the only post-Twilight Zone TV series that I give any respect to, have you seen Black Mirror?
I have seen a couple of episodes, yes.
Okay, so they've done about 40 episodes since 2015 or something. You know, listen, just like Twilight Zone, they've got their clunkers, but they have a handful, I think, of great episodes. It's 21st century technology run amok. And it's been called the 21st century Twilight Zone. The reason why is because, unlike Jordan Peele, who farmed out all those episodes, I think he only wrote and directed one in the second season, which also sucked. But my point is that you know, it's Charlie Brooker, the English writer, who's the kind of showrunner like Serling was.
Right.
That's why Black Mirror has an integrity that none of the Twilight Zone remakes have had. When I'm talking Twilight Zone, I'm only talking about the original.
Tell me about The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. I read that as a play in one of the English books when I was in school.
That is the episode probably most cited when people write about the Twilight Zone and discuss its historical impact and the great episodes, and especially if they're talking about society and politics and, people interacting with each other. They always cite Monsters Due on Maple Street. It was one of the episodes in my Twilight Zone in the Age of Corona. Let me tell you something.
Yeah.
The pandemic shut down. We still had our electricity. We could still watch all of our movies and order in Chinese food, right? It's when the electricity goes out. This is I think the 12th anniversary of Hurricane Sandy on the East Coast. I remember here, I'm in Westport, Connecticut. We lost power for 3 whole days. Oh my God. Well, in a wealthy white suburb like Westport, an hour out of New York City.
Right.
There was one Starbucks that had power, and you could go and charge your phones. Well, I went there one of those 3 days. I'm telling you, it was one step from being Lord of the Flies of like white wealthy people going riot over access to these portals for their electricity. And if during the pandemic shutdown, Dan, we had been deprived of our electricity and we couldn't watch our TV shows while hunkered down, right? People would have rioted in the streets. It would have made Black Lives Matter look like my pet goat. But thank God that didn't happen. But Monsters Do on Maple Street, which I place, that could have been in Science and Superstition. It could have been in multiple categories.
Suburban Nightmares.
It was a suburban nightmare.
Yeah, your friends, you can't trust them anymore.
Well, and the thing is, it's how easily we turn on each other. Sociologists, philosophers have been talking about how did the Holocaust happen?
Yes.
How did the German people follow quote, orders, whether you were in the army or a civilian, you followed orders. How did a whole society basically turn evil? We're about to find out on November 5th, by the way.
The episodes of V, the original V.
1983, yeah.
Awesome. I loved it, but it went directly back not only to World War II, but to Monsters Are Due on Maple Street.
And also To Serve Man is basically...
It was, but I see the other one.
Aliens that come to Earth in human form, that's a whole other episode. The thing about Monsters on Maple Street, yeah, it's revealed that aliens have manipulated the electricity
to turn people against each other.
Against themselves.
Yeah.
And turn it into a Lord of the Flies. Or almost like I in my essay on that episode of my book, I describe it as literally a Night of the Living Dead, where they eat each other alive.
Very well,
Shelter, which you brought up before, which was season 3, is like the sister episode to Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, which I also placed in Suburban Nightmares, because that's where, during the bomb scares of that time period, the early 60s, when the atom bomb was hanging over everybody's head like the sword of Damocles, the alarms go off that the bombs are about to drop. And only one neighbor has a bomb shelter. And the sight at the end of this episode of all the other neighbors, like a mob breaking in January 6th, anyone? 2001? It's incredible how Serling, again, the definition of art, it's of its time. Serling was writing in response to the bomb shelter craze kicked off by Khrushchev in 1961 during his first conference with Kennedy, where he said, he basically used the words thermonuclear war as a threat. Kennedy went back and said, yeah, well, we're going to have a bomb shelter in every American, basement. And that kicked off in 1961, the summer. It was like the hula hoop craze, except it was bomb shelters, not hula hoops. And Serling was faced in California with, do we build a bomb shelter? And in the end, he decided not to, because he said, what kind of world is this? Where we're going to kill each other over access to the bomb. But he wrote the episode and put it on the air. It was the 3rd episode in the fall of 1961, right? 6 months after the Kennedy-Khrushchev conference, where that kicked off. So again, it was of its time, but you watch it today and it's like, oh my God, this episode could have been written and performed after January 6th. 2021.
And we've seen people freaking out because one isn't wearing a mask. And they were threatening to fire. Well, they got rid of a bunch of soldiers who didn't want to take it.
But in the shelter, Serling portrays, without calling him a Jew, he was Marty Weiss. Serling, in the censors and those, that you couldn't say Jew, but he's got the American, white man named Frank Henderson, call him a foreigner. His name is Marty Weiss, and he looks ethnic. He's a character actor. But the tension, I think Stephen King wrote a book in a nonfiction overview called Dance Macabre in 1981,
Mm-hmm.
An overview of the science fiction, horror, and fantasy genres. Got a whole chapter dedicated to the Twilight Zone.
Okay.
Brought up The Shelter, and he said, never before on American television had we seen the thin veneer of, I mean, I'm paraphrasing him, the thin veneer of civilization ripped off of, you know, the American perfect, you know, neighbors that right when the episode started all loved each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that was what Twilight Zone did. You know, David Lynch's greatest movies were showing the dark underbelly of modern America, of suburbia, whatever, Blue Velvet, Mulholland Drive, his masterpiece, I believe. But there's a very Twilight Zone twist in Mulholland Drive.
Right.
That comes right out of an episode written by the great Charles Beaumont called Shadow Play, which influenced Christopher Nolan's Inception. It influenced The Matrix. I mean, it's another incredible Twilight Zone foundational episode that again gave birth to our modern American. You know, David Lynch is one of Serling's metaphorical children.
Mm-hmm.
I wish they would give David Lynch a new Twilight Zone, because Twin Peaks is basically his Twilight Zone.
Yeah.
Right. But my point is, he would have been a better choice than Jordan Peele.
All right. Arlen, I'm going to step back for a minute. Got to run a couple of money makers here, and then we'll be right back with you. Okay. But you hold on. I love the Twilight Zone. I remember when, God, what was that? Night Gallery came out, and it was so, there was a couple, 3 good episodes, but it was so much less than when Serling had full control. That was just such an amazing show, and it will never be reproduced in that way. But if you haven't seen it lately, if this is something you watched in 1978 on public broadcasting, guys, you need to go back and check it out again, because you'll be shocked how some of these can just blend right in with what's going on today. And speaking of what's going on today, let's talk about this.
The UNX Network presents a health and wellness spiritually based brand of hemp-derived CBD products made by Hopewell Farm in Harrogate, Tennessee. We apply our Cathara energy work with all of our plants and products. Our products made in small batches with only 2 ingredients of pure hemp, full spectrum crude oil, and coconut-derived MCT oil. Third-party lab tested for potency and legal THC levels with 6 strengths of 1 ounce oil to choose from. Know what you're buying and get what you pay for from Hopewell Farm. Applied directly to a specific area, Hopewell Farm topical salve in 1 ounce and ½ ounce sizes, made with pure hemp crude oil, comfrey extract, and all natural ingredients. Find the Hopewell Farm link and coupon code on the UNX Network website at unxnetwork.com. That's unxnetwork.com. While most near-death experiencers return to this plane of existence with alluring tales of their time spent in the presence of the divine, what happens when one crosses the veil into the afterlife, into the void? In the new book, Dying to Meet Them, Mindy Toutfest describes her journey to the afterlife after a devastating aneurysm. How a strange turn of events would lead her to spiritual growth, divine healing, UFO experiences, and a greater understanding of the universe. Get your copy of Dying to Meet Them today at Amazon.com or visit unxmedia.com for more information on this book and more amazing selections from UNX Media Publishing at unxmedia.com.
All right, friends, there's so much on this we got to talk about. I want to talk to you after the show about joining the UNX Network. But for right now, I got to get back to Arlen, because as you can see, we got a lot to talk about. We're both huge fans of Rod Serling and his writing.
Yes.
Name an episode is there an episode you could say, Dan, this is my favorite?
I'll always go back to the classic pig face episode, Eye the Beholder.
Which you were going to put under person or self-identity.
Well, it's not. It's an obsolete man, actually.
Really?
It's
Okay.
about man versus society. It's all about conformity. It's about individuality. It's about maintaining your individuality. Society would prefer we all wrapped in bandages looking alike. We must unwrap our own bandages to become who we are. That's one take on this great episode. But the memorability, if you saw it, especially when you were a kid, when you see those pig faces, I wish I had a picture of them right now, but they're both equally ridiculous looking and horrible looking.
Yeah.
Being able to ride that line, Dan, between comedy and horror is a very thin, difficult line. And it's rarely ever traversed. But Serling and the Twilight Zone traverse that with those pig faces. When you first look at them, you almost laugh at first. The pig face snouts,
right,
the curled upper lip. But then they're also repellent. They're grotesque. And that kind of schism is what makes those pig faces burn into your brain forever.
Yes.
So the impact of that episode, whenever I saw it as a kid, is something that stayed with me forever. Out of all the episodes in my book, the 68, that one has the most pages devoted to it.
Wow.
And that's because, again, in its time, 1960, the dawn of the civil rights movement, Serling, very socially aware, a Jewish humanist liberal of the 50s and 60s, you could see that Janet Tyler, the woman, in a very white hospital setting, the way they talk about her affliction so that she would be segregated in a communal place of their own is very ghetto without using the word ghetto.
Right.
But that was Serling. In my episode essay on the episode, I discussed that it was Serling's metaphor for the nation's civil rights movement that was just getting started in 1960. And it was Serling, Janet Tyler represented Black people in a white society, this white hospital setting where everybody looks alike. We find that at the end. And in the same way the hippies would later call the cops pigs, here Serling is using the pig metaphor for white racist America that he saw in 1960 coming at. He wanted to do a 90-minute live television play in the 50s about the Emmett Till incident in 1955.
Yes, I heard about that.
Off the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks, when she refused to sit down in the back of the bus or get up from her seat, she was thinking about Emmett Till. Serling, nice Jewish boy, wanted to write about Emmett Till in 1955, right after it happened. Of course, the censors wouldn't let him. Whatever ended up on the air was so declawed of anything related to the Emmett Till incident.
Right.
But Serling kept that social consciousness, speaking out against the evils of American post-war society, as he and so many other writers. Serling came out of it. He was almost like a beatnik in Hollywood in the sense of his concerns that became the countercultures later. In 1960, the great episode of Stop at Willoughby.
Yes.
About the Madison Avenue madman who can't take the rat race. But he's married to a materialist shrew of a wife in Westport, Connecticut, by the way, wealthy white suburb of New York, where she's only married to him for his rich ad agency salary.
Right.
Can't take the pressure. And he goes, some people can't take country clubs they wear around their necks like a badge of status, rich communities they don't feel comfortable in. He just wants to be himself. This is 1960. Serling, as a visionary of the 60s, is forecasting what the 60s partially would be about. It was the counterculture, the baby boom generation that refused to accept the values of the greatest generation, as Tom Brokaw later dubbed it. Their parents, the World War II generation that had been through the Depression and World War II.
Yeah.
But in the greatest boom of prosperity, the baby boom generation comes along and says, we don't want that. We want something more meaningful. We want something more real. Serling gave the counterculture glimpses of what society could be if there wasn't racism, if there wasn't war, if there wasn't these things. 3 or 4 of the episodes I discuss in my book forecast our involvement in Vietnam. Again, the Twilight Zone was both the father of American popular culture, the Stephen Kings and the... By the way, I was quoting Stephen King in Dance Macabre. He said, the Twilight Zone lit the imaginations of me and those of my generation that ignited, and I'm paraphrasing him, ignited the sparks, because Serling showed, like nobody had since H.P. Lovecraft, the possibilities of what we could do if we took science fiction and fantasy and horror seriously, not what science fiction had been in the 1950s with giant ants and all those ridiculous films, but adapting serious science fiction. You know, you got to remember, science fiction to American literary critics before Twilight Zone was considered trash literature.
But he could do things they wouldn't let him do with regular people.
Exactly, and he did it. See, Serling didn't create science fiction, fantasy horror. No, he adapted, but the original episodes he wrote and the other writers were in the style of those things. What he did was he brought them to television. The medium was still relatively new, especially film television. In the 50s, all the great television was out in New York, shot live. That's where Serling won his 3 Emmys. That gave him the creative clout to do the Twilight Zone.
Right.
So he does the Twilight Zone. What he couldn't do in the 50s, he does it in film television. He brought the serious science fiction from science fiction literature. All those pulp novels he probably read while he was in the army, like everybody else read comic books and stuff. But Serling loved all that stuff. He wasn't a science fiction writer himself, but he knew what great science fiction was because he was a fan. And getting Richard Matheson and Charles Beaumont on board early on with the Twilight Zone, that's called having your bona fides or bona fides, or however you pronounce it. So, and that's why, you had great writers, great directors, great stories, great dialogue, great cinematography that won Emmys, and they're great stories, well told in a very simple way of seeing Twilight Zone. But they were there's never been half-hour anthology dramas since. And there wasn't anything like, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, One Step Beyond, Thriller, Outer Limits, all these other shows were all pale shadows of the Twilight Zone. Only the Twilight Zone has stood the test of time. That none of Outer Limits, don't even get me started on that. But the best thing about it was the opening. We are in control of the
It had its moments. It had
its moments, but listen, I knew the Twilight Zone, and you, sir, are no Twilight Zone. Okay?
All right, let me throw this one out at you, because it was not one of the most deep, thought-provoking episodes, but it's my favorite.
Maybe.
A Game of Pool.
That's your... Wait. Why would you immediately assume that? Why?
Because a Game of Pool did not get as deep as Monsters Are Due in Maple Street or the Shelter.
Hold on. First of all, there are shades of deep. Not everything has to be comparable to everything else. Yeah, Monsters Are Due on Maple Street is a great episode about that. But A Game of Pool made my cut. and it's in the episode Obsolete Man.
Okay.
Now, why do you think it's in the episode Obsolete Man?
I would have thought it would be under personalities again.
Meaning what? A question of identity?
Yeah, because he wanted to be this guy, and
okay, this is why I love having these discussions, Dan.
Okay.
Because I purposely threw down a gauntlet. And like I said, I end my preface with the words, let the debates begin. The fact that so many great episodes, just like all the great stories in any genre, can be put into different themes, because that's why they're great. They cover more than one great theme.
Mm-hmm.
I put a game of pool in Obsolete Man because if you get into a discussion about what it was about becoming obsolete in the sense of passing on this burden of having to be the best throughout eternity. And every cock of the walk challenges you. That's a type of, there's obsolescence in winning as well as in losing.
Okay.
You know, be careful what you wish for, you may get it.
So he wanted to be obsolete, Jonathan Winters.
Well, he wanted to be, the king, but, it's like lonely is the one that wears the crown, and when you get to the top, it ain't what is crown. Is it not a modern cliche that wealthy celebrities often talk about how when they've gotten to the top of what the layman thinks is success, what do they find? It's empty. Money doesn't matter. Yeah, it doesn't matter to you. You got $1 million back. But, Jim Carrey has made a whole career out of talking about how, hey, people, let me tell you, I was at the top and it ain't what it's cracked up to be. And many people crack up because when they get to the top, it is empty. If you put an unhappy man on a throne, this sounds like some old Yiddish proverb. If you put an unhappy man on a throne, he'll still be unhappy.
Mm-hmm.
So Obsolete Man deals with characters. You know the episode Steel by Matheson with Lee Marvin about the boxer?
Mm-hmm.
It's all about he doesn't think he's obsolete. He thinks he's a human being boxer, that he can go up against a robot. And which is also, that goes back to the John Henry legend, the black slave, ex-slave that built the railroads, the legend of John Henry. He went up against the steam-powered drill, and that's where the legend of John Henry started.
Sure.
But that was,
he won, but he did it to his own death.
It killed him. Mm-hmm. And the episode Steel is basically Matheson's updating of the John Henry legend. Yep. But, it's got so many, again, in 25 minutes, Dan, Serling, Matheson, Beaumont, all the great writers, they were able to get across concepts so deep, and that philosophers and wise men and intellectuals have been debating for as long as men have been debating. Mm-hmm. And they were able to do it in 25 minutes. They're like primers on how to tell a story with no excess, with no fat. You watch these great episodes, Dan, and they're remarkable in how in the first 30 seconds, they can suck you in to the situation, which all of a sudden upsets. Again, it's like surreal. All of a sudden, what you thought was reality has shifted.
Yeah.
In the first 30 seconds or first minute of some of these episodes. Then they build to a halfway 15-minute, little mini cliffhanger. The Twilight Zone episodes are really 2-act plays filmed on television. They're very graphic, very simple, very sparse. And then the second half begins and it builds towards the classic surprise ending, twist ending. Other people did it, like Alfred Hitchcock had surprise endings. Mm-hmm. Serling didn't invent the surprise ending, just like he didn't invent science fiction. O. Henry, the author, is what is usually given the credit for coining the twist ending. They call them O. Henry S. endings. But Serling, again, perfected the twist ending on American television. And that is what makes these Twilight Zones so incredibly memorable, are those incredible twist endings. But in terms of telling a story in 25 minutes and leaving you with thought-provoking ideas, and that's what Stephen King was describing, like it lit our imaginations. And that generation, Stephen King, Stephen Spielberg, again, you can rattle off everyone, and then the second generation, J.J. Abrams, Chris Carter, and on and on. So if Serling, who died in 1975, 50 years old from all those cigarettes he smoked, he died the year Spielberg did Jaws, the year Carrie came out as a film.
Yeah.
Before the ride, before Close Encounters, before Poltergeist and E.T. in the 80s, before Star Wars. If he had only lived 5 years longer, he would have seen the impact that the Twilight Zone was having on the American pop culture surrounding him. So he thought in 75, when he talked about Twilight Zone, we had some good, turkeys, and we had some episodes I'm proud to have been a part of. And he always said he wanted to be remembered as a writer. Well, let me tell you something. Not only is Rod Serling one of the greatest television icons visually of the 20th century, not only does he have the greatest broadcast voice of the 20th century, not only should he be considered the greatest American television writer of the 20th century, but he should also be considered one of the greatest American writers of the 20th century.
Of all time.
Because of how he used television as a vehicle to get across these incredible episodes about the human condition, dispersed among the masses in a way that would influence generations. I posit Serling in my essays as like an Old Testament Jewish prophet, just like Bob Dylan was for rock and roll in the 60s. They were both in 20th century bodies, but their morals, their ethics, their ideas, their philosophies in mediums that were considered by American, society as trash.
Yes.
Rock and roll and television. But Dylan redeemed rock and roll by bringing poetry and lyrics and depth of meaning and philosophy to pop songs. And the Beatles, of course, were influenced by him to do what they did. And Serling did it in television. And, it's funny. You got the 5 books of Moses. I got the 5 themes of the Twilight Zone. I call my book, Dan, the Torah of the Twilight Zone. Because the wisdom of Serling and the other writers, I tried to write about in these essays about these episodes that dealt with these incredible themes and ideas that, again, are almost biblical in their profundity, if that's the correct use of that word.
Let me take you back about 45 years. I think you were old enough to remember that far back.
Well, give me the year. Don't 45 years. You're making me do math.
I was watching an episode of MASH.
Okay, what year is this? When you say 40?
Oh, God, this would have to be mid-70s, maybe late 70s, maybe around 77, 78.
Okay.
MASH was on.
Yes.
There was an episode where a soldier was dying or dead.
Yes.
And only one person could see him because he was feverish. And at the end, he joins up. And I'm sitting here watching it going, this is the passerby.
Wait, he joins up what?
A bunch of other soldiers were walking away, but it turned out they were all dead, just like in the passerby.
One of the great.
And I'm thinking, this is Serling's book. This is Serling's writing.
Do you know who wrote that episode by any chance?
I don't.
Okay, so that is an example of what I call Twilight Zones. When they talk about the character, the Shadow, he's everywhere but nowhere, Twilight Zone's influence is so pervasive that it's almost invisible, in the sense of whether whoever wrote that episode consciously acknowledged it, didn't realize, it's like when people are accused of stealing a melody from another song. George Harrison was accused of stealing My Sweet Lord from He's So Fine, right?
Okay.
So I'm saying that episode is exactly The Passersby, which was a Serling original about the Civil War in 1961, which was the 100th anniversary of the Civil War. So once again, he's writing to his time, because one of the characters, the woman played by the great Joanna Linville, who was in that great Star Trek episode where she's the Romulan commander.
Right.
Maybe the best episode of season 3, but one of the great. I mean, that ranks in my top 5. I don't know about you. Are you OG Star Trek?
Yes, absolutely.
So
although Deep Space Nine was really good too.
Okay, but where do you rank that Romulan episode?
I'd put that in the top 5 easily.
That's my point. Anyway, Joanna Linville, her other claim to pop culture fame is The Passersby. And she mouths Serling's dialogue where it's Serling addressing the racist South that's still hanging on to the lost cause and is hanging on to, the way they feel about black people. Now, Serling couldn't say those things overtly, but he says it in The Passersby more implicitly, if I'm using implicit right.
I think so.
He implies it in hopes that the audience will infer from it, right?
Well, that was an amazing show. And the book you've got, how do people find it?
Okay, so if they want to get a signed hardcover directly from me, my website, arlenschumer.com, just make sure you spell my name right, all one word. There's a Twilight Zone subpage that has a way to get my book directly through me. It's got its own page, so you can't really miss it.
Okay.
And that, of course, when you hold this little hardcover in your hand and the beautiful images that I grade back, in graphic design terms, we call this ghosting an image behind the text. So, so this is the episode called You Drive, about a car that comes to life and drives down a hit and run driver who doesn't own up to his crime. Well, Stephen King wrote a book called
Christine?
Yeah.
The
Car Comes to Life. So if you notice, as you're reading my essay, ghosted behind the image is the steering wheel from the point of view of the phantom driver, right? So that's what I do in my book graphically. And considering so many of the episodes were ghostly or eerie, the ghosting of you see how you can see the Canamitz come to serve man, but yet you can still read the text. And every episode has its own, I want to find the right page here. Its own, little TV set introduction. So as a graphic book designer, I tried to make the book reflect the black and white television aesthetic of the Twilight Zone itself. So what I recommend for people, especially newbies, the Twilight Zone streams on Paramount Plus. If you watch the episodes in the order I place these 68 episodes, watch the episodes first. Form your own opinions, then read my essay about the episode. And I guarantee, whether you're an aficionado or a newbie, if I've done my job well, Dan, I guarantee you'll either learn something, you'll think about something, you'll feel something about these episodes you may not have ever felt before. And in that way, my book acts as a kind of viewer's guide to what I call the Twilight Zone's greatest hits. It's also a great TV viewing experience to share with your significant other. You know how we all need TV shows we can share? Well, the Twilight Zone is for men and women. Some of the greatest episodes that I write about, especially, are about single independent women.
Sure.
At a time when, in the early 60s, the only women on TV were either screwball comedians like Lucille Ball or domesticated housewives like, Donna Reed. Serling, who had two daughters of his own, probably thought, hey, they're people. And some of the greatest Twilight Zone episodes are about single independent women.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one great episode, Midnight Sun, is about a young female artist living in New York City.
Yeah.
I mean, 1961, nobody trusts me on American television, in which every third TV show was a Western.
Yes.
There were no other shows, dramatic shows, about a female artist living in New York City in 1961.
No.
That is Serling, the visionary. You go about Roddenberry diversity casting in Star Trek. Who do you think was the first diversity casting? Serling. He had a black man in a dramatic episode in 1960 when there were literally no black people on television. Right?
Right.
Serling the visionary.
Very little.
And it's all in my book.
All right. And that is available on Amazon?
Yes.
And anywhere else?
Probably through the publisher Bear Matter.
Okay.
Media. They publish like literally hundreds of books on American pop culture. And I'm in that, system as well. But hey, get a signed hardcover directly from me, baby.
All right. Well, Arlen, this has been fun, and I got to bring you back some more. We can debate a lot more shows.
Dan, listen, anytime. We are now forever bonded. we are joined now.
Well, I hope to get you back. Maybe we can get together and badmouth. What was it? The one I mentioned earlier that Serling did after the Twilight Zone.
Well, let's good mouth, not bad mouth.
Night Gallery was not that great.
Please, it was hard. Listen, again, there's a coffee table art book about Night Gallery. There are fan groups about Night Gallery. You can get the whole thing on DVD. Let me tell you something. I've watched them. I watched them when they were originally on. I thought they sucked. I thought there's less than one handful, really. And even then, I recently rewatched them because everybody's like, Arlen, you have to see it on DVD, on Blu-ray. Somehow it's going to be so much better. Let me tell you something. I watched all those episodes. Even the ones they claim were Serling's greatest, The Messiah of Mott Street, and what was the other one that he wrote that they talk about? They're tearing down Tim Riley's bar with William Wyndham. I watched them recently on Blu-ray DVD. Let me tell you something. They were horrible. The scripts were the worst. What everything Serling was always accused of critically. Preachy, wordy, sermonizing, overwritten. And these are the episodes that these Night Gallery aficionados are telling me that are as good or greater than Twilight Zone.
All right, Arlen, I'm bringing you back because we got to argue.
Get me started.
All right.
Man, you got me started. You got me started.
All right. Once again, folks, the 5 themes of the Twilight Zone. And as you can tell, he's a little passionate, more so than even me. And I thought I was the passionate one.
Listen, it's not a competition, my brother.
Hey, listen, take care of yourself, man. And we'll get you back on here and we'll talk some more because this has been a lot of fun.
Hey, man, I had a blast. Thank you for having me on, Dan. And anytime you want to chat about anything and everything, I'll always make myself available.
All right. We'll talk soon, buddy. You take care.
You too. Thanks, man.
That was fun. And guys, like I said, after Halloween, we needed that. We just needed to be able to have a good time. And what better than the Twilight Zone? It was such a good show. I have overspent my time. I apologize. I'm going to go ahead and step out, but I will be back next week with a new guest. So you folks, the most important thing, of course, I can ask you to do is stay spooked. Good night.